Bring in our guest, TD Ameritrade Network contributor Jenny Horn, joining me here in studio, and joining us as well is the VP of Research at LikeFolio.com, Megan Brantley. And we have a very interesting kind of conversation here that I think these stocks are both making their fast market debuts in Match and in Bumble. And Jenny, for those who maybe aren't familiar with these are basically online dating software, but kind of the new ways of doing that, kind of the connecting through the mobile device. And I'd imagine this is a part of the market that was exploding in COVID when there were so many other ways of meeting people kind of taken off the table.
It was, like you mentioned, I mean, Bumble even has features beyond dating where they have like Bumble BFF, which is actually a way to just make friends. So what is interesting about both of these companies is, like Alex mentioned, they rose to relevance during the pandemic because we were sort of in this, contactless world. So these apps gave ways to meet people, say perhaps without having to have, contact. So for that reason, they both had very great years. In terms of growth, I mean, Match rose about 12% in terms of its subscriber base just in the first quarter alone on revenues that increased 23%. They saw pretty significant blowout earnings also in the first quarter, which were back in May. Now, Match is considered sort of the global world leader in terms of the online dating sites, namely because it has so many different brands. Just to name a few: Tinder, Match, OkCupid, Pairs, and Plenty of Fish, whereas Bumble really is just Bumble. Now, Match, some would say, being more diversified, has less risk than Bumble, since Bumble is just Bumble. But Bumble is also newer in terms of its market. So it went public back in February, and in the first half of the year, it actually outpaced its targeted growth of about 30%. Now, it has guided lower for the second half of the year, but it's seen pretty significant growth. Its revenue rose about 19% in the last year. It's really grown its paying users, which grew about 30%, and its growth is actually expected to really continue at these strong levels even as the pandemic passes. So I think a lot of these companies rose to relevance, and they will continue to be relevant even as the world returns to normal. Now, Match just closed its acquisition of actually HyperConnect for about $1.7 billion. It's an app focused specifically on Gen Z and millennial dating based in Seoul, Korea. And that is what our first tweeter today talked about. I thought this was interesting since Match already has so many brands. So our first tweet of the day says, in summary, HyperConnect can help Match Group's growth in Asia and expand its technology and monetization capabilities. In turn, Match can help HyperConnect scale and expand its reach. It sounds like a perfect match. Watch the upcoming quarters. So loved this sort of pun there, and I think that this just shows Match's scale, again, being the global leader in this dating space, because now it is expanding into Asia, which is of course a huge market to get into. But our next tweet actually focuses on Bumble. Match is not necessarily the only name in this space. Bumble, it does still have room to grow, despite the fact that it is a very new company. And our next tweeter today says, Bumble is growing faster at a lower revenue multiple. Online dating is a smart post-pandemic reopening play. But what if Facebook or even Netflix, yes, Netflix, made serious plays in this space? Barriers to entry are low, hence Match's many apps. So, okay, Megan, I'm not so sure what a Netflix dating app would look like. I thought that was interesting because I really have no idea what it would look like. But I'm curious, as far as Bumble to Match, how they sort of compare, because again, Bumble is so new, Match has so many brands, but they are both still kind of, the two names in this space.
Yeah, Jenny, I have never heard about a Netflix dating proposition, but that sounds really interesting. I'd love to see how that would play out. But, whenever we look at Match and Bumble, as you mentioned, these are two very different companies. Match has, more than a dozen different brands underneath its umbrella, whereas Bumble is just Bumble. Match definitely has more of a global presence. So you kind of have to take this perspective and this big picture view whenever you consider, the data that we're looking at. And when we look at this, I think that the outlier grid that we have, especially this short-term view, is really interesting because it shows this larger volume that Match has, but it also shows that Bumble is in that top right quadrant, which is what we really like to see when we see something growing. And so I think what this is showing is that, yes, while Match is this established company, it has a huge user base, there is a new player in the game, and Bumble's doing really well. Its consumer happiness is about 5 points higher. People report their experience being better when they're using Bumble versus the total mentions for Match. Typically, the highest number of brands being mentioned under that Match bubble are going to be your Tinders, your Hinges, your OkCupids. That's what we're mostly picking up on. And so I think that it's relevant for people to see that, yes, while Match has done very well and is the global leader, there is kind of a new emerging player on the scene in Bumble that's actually doing really well in our data. And, as you mentioned, they did have a strong report. I think that they were punished because they gave what some were considered to be weak guidance, but our data is actually setting up that they may not be doing as weak as they expected, perhaps, that users are onboarding at a faster clip on a quarter-over-quarter basis, where this chart that you're showing right now, this is Match. So this is all of the mentions of the different apps underneath Match's umbrella of people who are signing up. And there was this huge surge at the beginning of COVID, as you talk about. Now we're seeing some tempering. We're seeing some normalization. You see quarter-over-quarter is actually down about 3%. So these are two different growth stories for sure, two different companies at different stages in their life for sure, but definitely some strength building out of Bumble and some weakness building into Match.
Megan, when you compare these companies in terms of size, Match has twice the float, 270 million versus 119 million in Bumble. Match has got a half dozen to a dozen different names within under its portfolio. Bumble has one or two at the most. So when you're comparing these two companies, is this an Uber Lyft kind of relationship where one is very focused on one thing, one is basically doing everything involved in these services? Is that what this is? One is more mature, one is younger, one is doing everything, one is doing one thing. Is it kind of an Uber and Lyft relationship?
That's interesting. I don't know necessarily that it's Uber Lyft in the fact that I think Uber is trying to be just a mover of everything, whereas Lyft is trying to just be a mover of people. Whereas, whenever you look at Match and you look at Bumble, they're both about building relationships. It's just that Match has a much larger footprint. I think that they do have slightly different approaches. As Jenny mentioned, Bumble is more than just building, a romantic relationship. There's a friendship element. I think that there's even a business mentoring element. So Bumble is more focused on just comprehensive building relationships, whereas a lot of the most popular platforms underneath the Match's umbrella are focused on, building those romantic connections. And I think consumers are kind of picking up on this difference as well. And that's why you see Bumble's sentiment a little bit higher too.
So Megan, I have to think that if people have success on one of these apps, they're more likely to be, happier about it and be, as far as consumer happiness, I have to think that if they find someone, they meet someone, they're with someone, they're happier, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. At least that's what they want to talk about it. I think that in general, too, just people who are using dating apps in order to meet other people, that's rising. We have those mentions at all-time highs. We actually have them increasing about 29% year over year. So more and more people are turning to these apps. I know anecdotally, I'll be heading to Nashville this weekend for an engagement party for a couple who met on Bumble. So I think that this is really relevant, especially in the younger generation. I think that this is an area that's expected to grow significantly. And so that's why, we're keeping an eye on both of these names to understand, what are they doing well, when are they executing well, and when are scenarios setting up that maybe the market doesn't expect. And that's what we're starting to see, just this emergence. Like, for example, if we were to have earnings today for Match, our earnings score would be about a -22. So what that means is that it just crossed that slightly negative threshold for us. Maybe not enough for us to act on it now, but definitely something we've got our eye on. Where in contrast, Bumble is starting to actually show quarter-over-quarter improvement. And they had a little bit cautious guidance, so we think maybe there could be a surprise in store. This is definitely a short-term lens whenever you're talking about a 30-day moving average quarter-over-quarter. But these are kind of the first indicators for us and what we like to key into whenever we're trying to spot those opportunities for traders. And so that's why we wanted to kind of bring this to say, okay, this is kind of two different trajectories that we're watching, and it'll be really, really fun to see how it plays out.
It absolutely will. And Megan, as we look at this, I kind of think as matches, you have less exposure to maybe the demographic situation, as they have some of the legacy platforms like a Match.com that maybe you're going to get an older demographic, as well as, of course, Hinge and Tinder, maybe targeting younger. Bumble is solely focused on this new age of online dating. And so, Megan, when you're looking at this, I would imagine that what the pandemic really did was accelerate this trend. And I know that's something else that you're focused on. We see a lot more signups clearly in the data, but there was always, and you hate to say it, but there's a stigma around this. Some people don't feel comfortable meeting people on these platforms the same extent that other people do. It's also urban, maybe you're a little bit more comfortable than you were in somewhere that's a little bit more smaller. And so when you see what happened over the last year, in many ways, was this an extraordinary opportunity for both these companies and this space in general to really kind of get beyond that and sign up somebody new, because maybe there are other ways of meeting people, be that for a friend or a romantic relationship, was taken off the table almost entirely?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think it was kind of normalized for anyone who is on the fence about it. I think that it's interesting too, when you look at this trend, a lot of times we show what a lot of people, they've called it like a shark fin, where you see this huge bump into COVID and then you see some normalization, but normalizing higher. But this isn't it. We did see an acceleration into COVID, and now we're seeing it continue higher. So it was this adoption spark and this continued acceleration. And that's why this dating app usage mentions they're at all-time highs. And so this is something that definitely both companies in this arena can benefit from. And we've definitely got an eye on them moving forward.
And I love the comparison versus one another. So the industry may be moving upwards together, but Bumble on a relative basis here, Megan, may be outperforming. And we're going to watch this closely. I'm sure we'll come back to these names. But Megan Brantley, the VP of Research at LikeFolio.com, it's always a pleasure. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you again soon. Jenny, the one thing I think is very